I'm Mark Miller. I'm the global editor of Bloomberg Live, and I am pleased to introduce Rebecca Hall to a conversation about her directorial debut film, which is called Passing, which is a Netflix film that will be coming out very shortly in theaters and then later on Netflix. I saw the film this afternoon, and of course it is still reverberating around in my mind. I think it provokes a lot of questions. We only have a short time, but I want to give people a sense of why this was an important movie, both for you to make personally and why you think it's an important film for this moment. I think, most audiences will know you as an English actress, right? But they probably don't necessarily know that you have a whole American side. Your mom is American. She's a famous opera star named Maria Ewing. You read the novel Passing that the film is based on several years ago. It's a 1929, very daring, I think, very profound, groundbreaking novel. Why did you read that novel, and why was that important to you?
Well, I read the novel because 13 years ago, maybe a little more, I was about 25, I was spending more time in America and finding myself in situations, much like you just said, where people made assumptions about me based on how I looked. And I knew that there was... I didn't have clarity around it, but I knew that there was some ambiguity around my mother's racial identity. She would say things to me like, it's possible that my father, I don't know, it's possible that I'm mixed race. It's possible he was black. It's possible that he was Native American. I don't really know. And every time this would come up, it would disappear just as quickly as it came up. And there was not much to explain why it was so furtive and so hidden. But I found myself in these rooms where people were making these assumptions about me, and I found myself increasingly uncomfortable with that, and sort of having to stick up my hand and say, well, actually, I know I look like this, but I might actually contain something else. And people would say, might, and I was like, yeah, I don't really know, but it's possible that, I'm mixed race. And it was a sort of awful thing to kind of like, because it was so vague, I didn't have any access, or, it wasn't like I could fully say it with authority, and that's very uncomfortable. And around that time, someone gave me the book. And honestly, I'm just really embarrassed to say this too. I looked at the book and I went, Passing? What does that mean? Like, why would you call a novel Passing? I had no idea. And I read the book, and it was instant context for me. Historical, yes, but also emotional. It gave me an access point of compassion and understanding, and it just made sense. I was like, of course, this explains why my mother doesn't know her father's family. Of course, this explains why something is hidden and secret and has this sort of air of something that we're not allowed to talk about, because any history of passing within a family is necessarily erased. It's necessarily hidden. A family protects and buckles down around someone who makes that decision. They don't have any other option. And when my grandfather had my mother and her sisters, he was already living his life as a white man. He'd already cut off the ties to his family. So when I read the book, yes, of course, I had this access point that was very specific and emotional as it pertained to race, but also beyond that, it also gave me a sort of framework from which to discuss what it means to have a mixed race identity. And also, it gave me a framework to think about identity at large.
Right.
And that was the piece that was breathtaking to me when I read it, because I thought, well, this is a great work of art. And like any great work of art, it transcends the specificity of the plot, the narrative that it's dealing with, and becomes something timeless and universal. And ultimately, you know, the big surprise when you sit down with the book or when you watch the movie is it's saying it's about this one woman who's hiding her racial identity, but it's actually about the other woman who's not hiding her racial identity, but is arguably hiding everything else about herself to herself. And so it ultimately becomes about how we negotiate our own identity, whoever we are, and how much freedom we have. I mean, how much freedom do we have? I mean, it's a constant negotiation between the story that we put out into the world about who we want to be and the story that the world puts back at us about who we ought to be. Right. And who knows how much freedom we have around that, you know?
There's a line where Irene, who's played by Tessa Thompson, says, it has a very specific context to the man she's saying it to, but I think it gets exactly to your point, and where she says, we're all of us passing for something or other. And I think that is the larger truth of the movie. We just showed a clip of the movie, so I think our audience can see what this is about. But as you just mentioned, it's about focused on two women who were childhood friends, one of whom is now passing as white, one of whom is not. But both are negotiating the choices that they've made and the lives that have both been foisted upon them and the lives that they've chosen to live. And it's fraught and complicated. I admired this as your first choice as a director. And I wondered if you were at all concerned. You have, as you just explained, you know, you have your own personal history with this phenomena, and you are mixed race in that sense. But as people would judge you and see you as this, you know, product of acting royalty in many ways and theater royalty from England, did you worry about how you would be perceived as the writer and director of this film?
It's not really a question that I can answer. I felt really compelled to make it for a lot of reasons. And I knew that there are plenty of stories that pertain to race in America that I would not feel that connection to because I don't have any understanding or experience of. But this story, it's in history, it's in the 20s, it was very specific to something that I felt a deep connection with. I would never undertake a piece of art that I didn't feel that with. But yeah, and plenty of people were concerned about it and would say, you know, but you're a white woman, why are you making this? And I'd be like, well, doesn't that just mean I'm just the walking embodiment of what this is all about? The fact that you just said that? Because you just assumed that based on how I look. And it's not actually true, so...
So at this event, the Bloomberg Equality Summit, we talk about equity and inclusion in a business context. So I want to talk about how difficult it was to actually get the film made. This was something you've been working on for years and years, and the financing, as I've read, was difficult. Although it ultimately sold, Netflix bought it for almost $17 million, which is pretty impressive. But talk about what you encountered as the producer and director of this film to get it actually made.
It was a very long and hard process. I mean, the first roadblock was my own because I didn't quite have the courage to do it. So the script sat in a drawer for 6 years. And then when I did get the courage to do it, it came out of the drawer and I showed it to people I trusted, producers, people in the industry. And they said, it's really wonderful, but I'm pretty sure you'll never get this made, which was very disheartening. And then I didn't listen to them, and instead, because there's like such a sort of like cognitive dissonance about this sort of notion of like, it's great, but like, well, if it's great, it's great. That's the end of the story. I don't need to, you know, like, I'm going to keep going. And then when it came to actually pitching it to companies and finance people, which I did endlessly, I cannot tell you how many pitch meetings I did where I pitched the idea. They'd just look at me and be like, it sounds very interesting, but you're a first-time filmmaker. You're asking to make this in black and white in a 4:3 aspect ratio about a very controversial, like, hot topic. And you've never done anything like this before. Why on earth would we trust that you could do it? Which I sort of understood, but I also slightly read it as we're not entirely convinced that a story that centers on the emotional lives of two women of color is going to be commercial. And I don't think I was wrong to think that. So I kept going. And then then the conversation changed slightly. I met Nina Yang Bon Jovi and Forrest Whitaker, who are two people who have a production company that make it their mode of operation to get greenlit the films that everyone says no to. I mean, that's literally what they do. So they were sort of the perfect partners, and they never said no to me about anything. They said, just keep going, just keep going. And at that point, a lot of the financiers said, we love it, but can you make it in color?
Right. And why is that? Why is black and white controversial?
Well, I believe that there's an assumption that it makes it niche and art house. And also, I got told once that it's something to do with the fact that you can't sell it to television networks because people assume if they're channel surfing and they land on it, they assume that their television is broken, so they don't watch it. That's what someone told me, and I was like, are you kidding me? In this day and age, I'm fairly sure that can't be true. Anyway, that's what I got told. So, I mean, I was really faced with a very real problem of, do I make this in color or do I risk not making it at all?
Right.
And this was after the movie had been greenlit, and then it fell apart. And then there was another year of trying to scrap together the end piece. But the decision I landed on was that for me, there was only really one way to make this movie, and I wasn't going to compromise. So I had to make compromises about the budget. I had to make it for less money than I would have liked, but I got to make it how I wanted to.
And the choice for black and white, as I read, is sort of a couple-fold, right? There are a couple of reasons why you wanted a kind of film noir aspect to it, which it definitely has. But I also think that the choice of shooting it in black and white really forces you as a viewer to really think in some ways about race in ways that maybe you wouldn't necessarily, that wouldn't be my first impulse in thinking about a black and white film. But I think
No, but that's the real reason. The sort of the noir thing is a kind of a happy byproduct. But the real reason is that black and white allows one to play with light and shade and tone, and to, in a sense, highlight the slippery reality of all these categories that we're so busy trying to put everyone in. And it's also the same with the 4:3. It's literally putting people in boxes. But black and white just seemed such an eloquent way of doing it. And some people might take from it that it's very literal, and it's not actually. It's quite the opposite. Like it's the idea is when it draws attention to these categories and also points out that it's a complete fiction, because even black and white film isn't black and white, it's gray. It's 1,000 shades of gray, just like the themes of this movie.
Right, absolutely. Do you think that the existence of these new platforms like Netflix and Amazon, and obviously I'm sure you must agree with this, but they do allow for the telling of more complicated stories in some ways than we might have seen when we were dominated by theaters only as the mode of transmission?
Yes. The fact that this movie is on Netflix, I find to be incredibly significant, because it means that millions of people can have potential access to it immediately. And that the sort of the broader sense of putting this story in the center of the culture is not lost on me. It's so important that we can see that this story about the emotional lives of two women of color can be central to the culture, can be upfront and accessible to millions, I think is incredibly important and wonderful. I also love that there is an option with Netflix, because it is, in my opinion, a really good film to experience in the theater, to see big, to have the sound. But the fact that you can have both, I think, just gives us a sort of broad access is always better. It has to be. I mean, I want this to be seen more than I want it to be appreciated in the cinema.
Right. It's a period piece in the ways in which you just described, 1929 New York, the Harlem Renaissance, that is all represented there. But there's also a through line to the story that I found obviously very contemporary, which is the degrees to which Irene and her husband argue about how to prepare their sons for the world that they're about to enter in. And that feels very contemporary.
Yeah, it's sort of sad, but it's true. It's not that conversation hasn't changed at all. All families that are raising black kids talk about this moment when they have to have the talk, and that is sort of what Irene and Brian are arguing about. And I think, if anything, I think the film sort of tries to allude to the fact that everybody needs to be having the talk, not just people who are raising black kids, but all kids, and that is very relevant to now. But I think I do think that all of the themes of the film, it never felt to me like a period piece.
Right.
It feels, yes, the societal constraints that are on someone like Irene to, like, the fullest expression of being a woman is to be a good mother and a good wife, and in her case, a good member of the black community, doing the right thing. And that's incredibly restraining. Of course, the rigidity of those confines on a woman's life today are not the same. But on a broader sense, there is still a certain amount of societal pressure to be a certain kind of woman.
Right, right. Has the film prompted new conversations within your family, your own family, particularly the American side?
Huge. I mean, I now know, my mother now knows about her grandfather. She now knows his name. She now knows what he did, and turns out to be a kind of extraordinary story and an extraordinary history that was erased before this. And now we have that. So it's enormous, actually.